don't come to work with MI6 or CIA because you love America or you love Britain, right? Do it to save your own country, because all of the indicators for your future and for your children's future are bad, and they're bad under Putin. And so if you want to, save your own country, right, then you should work with the West.
This is a conversation with David Gioe. David has over 2 decades of experience as an intelligence officer, starting his career in the FBI and later joining the CIA, first as an analyst and later becoming a field-qualified operations officer. He deployed a number of times and worked on counterintelligence, clandestine operations, and covert action. After retiring from the CIA, David moved to academia, and today he works as a professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he's a visiting professor of intelligence and international security at the King's College London. In this conversation, we talked about how the world of intelligence really works, how has it changed since the Cold War, or how CIA officers working in the field do their jobs at a time when anonymity is increasingly disappearing. And also about how the CIA manages to stay ahead of the Russians, why Chinese spies do things differently than everyone else, about the war in Ukraine, and much, much more. Thank you to everyone who's supporting this podcast on Patreon, because you make this possible. If you want to follow David and read more about his work on these issues, you can follow him on Twitter or go to his website. Both links are in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much.
So, I'd like to talk today about how spies and intelligence agencies operate today. But to better understand that, maybe it makes sense to start by looking at the past. And if you look at Spycraft and how intelligence agencies operated for most of their history during the Cold War, and then today, how different is what you could call the nature of the game, the nature of their role and activities in 2024 today from how they typically used to operate for most of their existence?
Sure. Well, thanks very much again for having me, Dominic. I do have to start because I have a couple of U.S. government affiliations. I just have to say this is only, the world according to Dave Gioe, and not to the U.S. government. But to your very good question, there's a yes and a no part of that answer. Has the nature of intelligence changed? Not really. There's a timeless sense that, for an advantage in statecraft, military operations, even economic advantage, that you want to know the plans and intentions of your rivals, your adversaries, sometimes even your allies, right? The thing that shouldn't be spoken about, in polite company. And so that means that there's always a need to penetrate the inner circle, right? To understand what other decision makers are thinking, so that your country, your company, your allies, whatever, that they can have the best chance at success from their point of view. And so, running spies and stealing secrets and providing, sort of decision advantage for statecraft, that's timeless. That said, look around. The world is a different place, of course, and I think your question is getting to an important way in which sort of the character of intelligence has changed, if not the nature. And one of the big ways there, as I'm sure you've guessed, is the role of technology in intelligence. And it's a double-edged sword. If somebody tells you, well, tech is bad, right? It's not good or bad. It's just new or newer, and we have to deal with it. So, on the plus side, for instance, the role of tech is enormously helpful in AI, helping analysts to save time by doing research, and I think in the public realm, the folks that look at imagery intelligence or geospatial intelligence, before you'd have to look at bazillions of pictures to see if anything has changed between satellite passes. And now, AI can say, hey, this is different. A human being might want to take a look at it. So there's so many advantages. OSINT, which we could talk about later, but I'd throw that in the tech bucket. Social media intelligence, all of these new ways. Of course, tech challenges the intelligence communities around the world for two big reasons that we can sort of dive into later. But just to kind of put them out there, the first one, of course, is the role of tech, biometrics, and like how does that challenge alias travel? How does that challenge how we recruit spies and how we run spies securely and effectively? So that's a big difference. Mass leaking, back in the old days, there was a spy for Israel called Jonathan Pollard, and he worked for the U.S. Navy as a civilian intelligence analyst. And in the old days, he would have to when he wanted to give intelligence to his handlers, he would print out like a bazillion pages from the printer, stuff it all into a garbage bag, and put it into the like walk out with it, and put it into the trunk of his car. And now people like Chelsea Manning, or the soldier from Iraq of WikiLeaks fame, can put bazillions of intelligence documents or diplomatic documents on a CD, right, and just walk right out with it. Or Snowden, famously, exfiltrated, 1.5 million documents from NSA, on tiny little, on thumb drives, the size of your fingernail. So, tech has made a huge difference. And then the other thing, just on the OSINT front, I think that's worth mentioning is that policymakers, now, they listen to podcasts and they see open source intelligence, and it really challenges, I think, their intelligence communities, be it in the U.S., the U.K., Germany, France, wherever, to really bring their A game, analytically speaking, because we see what's happening in the world, right? And it almost gets back to first principles for the analyst, right? It's not future prediction as much as it's sense making. What's going on? And so I think, you could understand how a policymaker would be grumpy if they asked for a particular briefing on a subject, and, CIA or DIA or the British Joint Intelligence Committee said, okay, well, leave your phone, come down to the secret room, and we're going to have a talk. And then, the policymaker who hates being away from their phone, right? Like, they show up and they get told basically what they've already read in the newspaper. That's not a good day, right? You've not really done your job very well. And so, just focusing on the different dimensions of tech, I think really does sort of illustrate the many, many ways in which, the nature of intelligence hasn't changed, but the character of intelligence and how we do it really has changed.
So I want to delve deeper into a lot of the things that you've mentioned now, and I think maybe the first one would be the role of OSINT, open source intelligence, because I think that that's hugely transforming how intelligence agencies work, and not just them, but just the role of intelligence in the world in general. And one of the big reasons is that because of proliferation of various technologies that you can use for open source intelligence, like satellite mapping and social media listening, now that's available to private citizens and private organizations, whereas before those things would only be available to government. And you have organizations like famously the Bellingcat, that is basically capable of things that many governments are not even able to carry out. So specifically, how do you think that the fact that citizens, private citizens and civilians can now have capacities at their hand that would only be available to the biggest handful of countries maybe a couple of decades ago, how do you think that's changing how intelligence works?
That's a wonderful question, and I get that from my students all the time. OSINT is a popular topic. I think narrowing down Bellingcat, I think, is important. I'm not a Bellingcat expert by any means, but I think when people if you were to say, hey, look up open source, intelligence in the dictionary, and there would just be one entry, and it would just be Bellingcat, and that's part of the story, but not the whole story, because openly available to who? For instance, companies sell data, right, that Dominic or Dave can't go get, right? We don't have that subscription, so it's not open to us. Bellingcat gets information, as I understand it, from people who cooperate with them on the dark web, right? And they have dark web, contacts and secure communications and things that sort of look more tradecrafty, than that what you and I could do. Um, and I think the other big disclaimer, of course, with a place like Bellingcat is, they put things together. They have software and they have research methodologies. That again, just advanced Googling isn't gonna get you. Um, so I'm amazingly impressed, with what they've been able to do, and as a former case officer, it sends shivers down my spine, that people have to operate in a world, in which there are places like Bellingcat, right, who've taken a normative judgment, as far as I understand, and I would applaud, to really focus like a laser, on Russian operations, and not on Western operations. But God forbid they change their mind. I mean, their methodologies, are really powerful. And then finally, a point that my friend Joe Hatfield at the Naval Academy, he's always saying, well, Dave, do you read Russian? No. Do you read Chinese? No. So is that open to you? Right. So who is it open to, is an important question. But, that sort of out of the way, the democratization of understanding the world, of seeing the world, I think has been tremendously transformative, and I think mostly for the good. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. As you've suggested in your question, during the Cold War, for instance, who has spy planes? The U.S. has high altitude, has the U-2 or the SR-71 Blackbird, or those sorts of things. Nowadays, you or I could look at Google Maps or look at NASA's, fire information management software. I can't remember what FIRMS stands for, but you can look at this stuff, or small states, and even think tanks. I know of several that do this. They actually pay for private satellite companies to go take passes over what they want. So you don't have to launch a satellite, build a satellite, communicate with a satellite. All of that is now available, and so I think it brings people sort of closer to the issue, if you like. I mean, Ukraine, for instance, I think is a great example, of this. We're sort of seeing, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or the Russian war in Ukraine, unfolds in real time. Everybody has a mobile phone, right? And so 10 years ago, nobody was making TikTok videos of Russian troops, heading through their villages. That now that's possible. Documenting war crimes, for instance, as I understand it, some of the earliest trials of Russian soldiers were actually sort of crowdsourced pictures and crowdsourced information. So, holding war criminals to account, is a wonderful thing. The lawyers, however, I think need to sort of weigh in on the question of who is a combatant when we talk about open source intelligence. For instance, if I'm walking through my village in Ukraine, and I see a Russian missile system being set up, and I take a picture of that and I send it to Ukrainian military intelligence, well, I'm clearly a combatant, right? I mean, that's, I then forfeit my Geneva Convention rights as a non-combatant, to the extent that the Russians care about such things, but that's a different question. But what if, for instance, I just take a video or a picture and I post it to TikTok, or I post it to Twitter, and then the Ukrainians are monitoring Twitter, right? And then they see it and then they take action. So am I a combatant? No. But did they use information that I provided for a strike on the Russians? Yes. So, I think a lot of the questions of the democratization of intelligence are quite unsettled still. And so I think a lot more thinking needs to be done on those topics.
And I would imagine that a lot is changing and continually evolving even right now with the war in Ukraine. But we're gonna talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to pick up on one more thing that you've mentioned, and that's how basically this proliferation of technology and open source intelligence, and but not just that, how it's, I assume, making the life of spies and the agents in the field a lot more difficult, because I imagine that with the amount of information you now have online, with basically every individual having some sort of a digital track in their past and having tools like automated facial recognition, I imagine that anonymity for everyone's becoming something, a thing of the past. And I imagine that from the perspective of a field operative who probably has a fake identity, this must be uh, extremely difficult when compared to the era before the invention of the internet. And I wonder to what extent is this still even possible or will be possible in the future.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and it's something I can assure you that I can tell you for a fact that that U.S. intelligence and British intelligence are dealing. I don't want to say they're struggling with. I mean, it's a hard question, and they're attacking that question as hard as they possibly can. I think as you say, you can't. In the old days, you could use different aliases in the same country. Now you just can't do that, right? Everything is linked. When you show up in an airport, they take your biometrics. Some countries even have gait analysis, right? How you walk, and AI can look at that. I mean, there's ways to defeat all of this, but it's really hard. And but the idea that there's a sort of the Hollywoodization of how to defeat this stuff, where there's some super nerd at NSA or in the back room hits a button, and the camera's blind for 2 seconds, and you walk by, and then they reboot the system. All of that stuff is movie stuff. And so I think a couple things. Number one is that sometimes it's just easier to move meetings to places that do not have ubiquitous technical surveillance, right? Like, let's just not try to defeat it. Let's just move the meeting somewhere else. So that's point one. Point two is that I think operating an alias was just sort of one of these things that people did because that's what intelligence officers do, right? That's what we always have done. Is there a way to operate in true name, right? So I'll just give you a little sort of primer on tradecraft. There's cover for action and then cover for status, right? So cover for status is who is Dave Gioe, right? So Dave Gioe is in this country as a representative of the Ace Tomato Company, and it's my job to sell tomatoes. Cover for action is what am I doing right now on this street corner, right? Am I eating a Mars bar and that sends a message to someone that I want to meet them next week, right? What is happening right now? If I park my car, with face out, right? That means everything is safe. But if I back I guess if I park it, with the opposite, right? With the nose into the parking space, maybe that means I need to call off a meeting. And so those kinds of things, fine, you can capture that on camera, but do you know what it means? So I think the intelligence officers are still going to be able to figure this stuff out. And the other thing is, just living here in the UK, we talk about, I think the Sergei Skripal assassination attempts, right, which you'll remember in 2018 in Salisbury. The British authorities had, tons and tons and millions of hours of videotape that they went through on trains, on buses. There's video from the two assassins checking into their hotel in East London. There's video of them waiting at the gates of the train, trying to figure out if their train is on time or not to get out to Salisbury. And so the entire resources of one of the most videoed, surveilled cities in the world, when did they get Skripal specifically, right? Nobody knows. They think that, they spritzed the poison on the door handle. There's no video of that. So, yeah, they figured out who they were by looking backwards through the tape. And so the surveillance is powerful. But number one, the surveillance didn't prevent anything. Those guys got back to Russia. Okay. Number two, it didn't save Skripal. I mean, he's as I understand it, he's still in a serious condition. So it didn't save him from the attack. And then that's even in a case where you have a crime, right? What happens if, so fine, let's not call it an attack. Let's just say that an intelligence officer met a source somewhere in London. Does that, what are you looking for, right? Two people on a park bench, or two people just doing a brush pass relatively quickly? They knew to look backwards in the tape with Skripal because there's a body, there's a crime, there's a thing that they saw. But what happens if there's no crime, there's no body, there's no thing that anybody saw? What are you looking for on the tape? The only other thing I would say on this topic, because it can get quite long-winded, is just about is about facial recognition, right? Because that's a whole other kettle of fish, and so as far as I understand it, AI is going to be able to potentially track you, as long as the cameras can see your face. So just because there's cameras doesn't mean there's various kinds of software that are processing what you have. And of course, how long are they keeping the data? I think the Brits, up until Skripal, I think they decided to keep camera footage for, I don't know, 2 weeks, 30 days, something like that. So if you have hundreds of thousands of cameras around, and then you're going to keep that for years, where are you going to store all that? So I think there's a lot of sort of hyperventilating about about the role of tech and how it's going to erode cover. But I think we just need to sort of take a more measured approach to it.
So maybe just to follow up, because it sometimes seems when you're reading about all of this that intelligence agencies will be forced to work more and more, from distance, from the office, using all these remote tools, rather than actually having agents in the field and operating physically in the place. But from what you're saying, it sounds like, to quote James Bond Skyfall, you still need the person in the field who knows when to pull the trigger or not.
Yeah. So the obituaries for human intelligence have been written over and over and over again, right? Oh, we're just going to hack for all the secrets, and we're that's fine. You can hack for some secrets, but there's a million reasons why you still need case officers. Take it with a grain of salt, right? A former case officer saying that we still need case officers, right? It's probably no different than fighter pilots, trying to keep the drones at bay. So take what I say with a grain of salt, I guess. But no, you still need people in the field for several reasons. Number one, does Putin put whatever he's thinking into his into his computer, right? My Secret Diary by Vladimir Putin, right? That's not a thing. So you have to have somebody as close to his inner circle as humanly possible. So we can do that. And I'll just go back to think operating in true name, right? Operating commercially, operating sort of outside of the expected traditional ways and covers in which intelligence officers work. So humans is not coming to an end. And then finally, a point I always like to make is there's a human in human intelligence, right? There's a human person that has fears, that has goals, that has psychological needs, that has a need for another human to interact with them. And so even if you can correspond securely with your agent over the internet, which, there's lots of questions about whether or not that's secure, but let's just say it is. You still have a need to meet with that person for any number of reasons, including, is that person actually who they say they are, right? Maybe your source has been arrested, and you don't know that, right? And so they've given up their credentials, to the counterintelligence service, and now you're corresponding with the counterintelligence service who's feeding you disinformation or luring you into a trap, or whatever. So, or that person has been compromised, and so yeah, it's still the same person, but now they're reporting everything that you say, and so there's just the Mark One eyeball, of having that person meeting with that other human being, no matter how good the tech gets. I think there's no replacement for that.
Another major change that, I think we're witnessing, especially in the recent years, is that I think mostly Western intelligence agencies are sort of increasingly coming out of the shadows. And they're sharing more intelligence than ever before, and they're using what's called strategic disclosure much more frequently than ever before. We've most notably seen it before the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but even William Burns, the director of the CIA, mentioned it in his essay in Foreign Affairs as one of the big things that the intelligence agencies has to accept and learn how to work with. What is, in your view, specifically behind this major shift?
Sure. So just to quickly define the term, strategic disclosure is using things that were previously classified, using secrets, to support a policy. And that could be a policy, as articulated by an administration official, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. In the UK, right, we saw Liz Truss, when she was the foreign minister, using it. And we saw Boris Johnson using, when he was prime minister, using strategic disclosures. So that's what it is. As a historian, I do have to say there's a prehistory to this, that goes back, at least as far as I can tell, and I'm on the hunt for more. But as far as I can tell, it goes back to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, was confronting the Soviet ambassador to the UN, Zorin, and Zorin basically said, well, there's no strategic, missiles in Cuba. So, you guys are just making up lies. And then, in sort of a theatric moment, I think, for the UN, Stevenson unveils these, big poster size photographs that the U-2 had taken of Soviet missile sites. I think Zorin didn't actually know that they were there, right? Which tells you something about, the Soviet, whole of government approach. But in any case, so we have, secret intelligence that I'm sure was secret or top secret that was then, displayed for everyone to see. And this is not a cost-free exercise, right? So now everybody knows, oh, okay, the US has this kind of capability. This is the resolution, right, that they can that the US can achieve with this platform. And so you're always giving up a little bit of your intelligence capability when you use it publicly, when you tell people the things that you can do. There are still good reasons to do it. And what was sort of striking to me as I was digging into this for a piece I was writing is that the Reagan administration actually really went to the well with strategic disclosure a couple of times. Once in 1983, Soviet fighter pilots had shot down the Korean Airlines, commercial civilian airliner that had strayed into Soviet airspace, and they were like, "We didn't do it." And then Reagan was like, "Yeah, you did, and here's the tapes." And then again, Reagan did it when in 1986 there was a bombing by the Libyans of a disco in West Berlin that killed 2 U.S. troops, I think a lady from Turkey, and wounded a bunch of other people. And the Libyans were like, "Who, us?" And then again, Reagan was like, "Yep, here's the tape." I think it was a diplomatic cable in that sense from the Libyan People's Bureau, right, their embassy back to Tripoli, that basically said we did this great thing, and then Reagan held it up and he's like, yep, here it is. So Reagan actually had a go at that as well. But getting to the sort of the brunt of your question with the Biden administration, yeah, they decided that, I think this goes back to Crimea, and in 2014, Putin was allowed to just say whatever he wanted to say about the little green men in Crimea, and then poof, before we knew what happened, he had annexed or seized Crimea, and everybody was like, "What just happened here?" And so, as the U.S. and the U.K., it was done very much jointly. But as the U.S. and the U.K. were seeing these moves by Russia, they had a pretty good sense of what the Russians were up to, and so they decided that they weren't going to let Putin get away with some sort of provocation or a false flag massacre, blaming Ukrainians for something that Russians had done. And so the administration went back to the well, so to speak, that the Kennedy administration used, or the Reagan administration, or others had as well. But they advanced it. And how did they advance it? They advanced it by going back. So before, it was like kind of a one and done, right? Hey, we use this to refute you, and good for us. Now the Biden administration has said multiple times, I think starting in December 2021, this is what the Russians are planning. This is what's going on. And so they kept at the same issue through strategic disclosures, and it didn't stop when the shooting started. They put out that President Biden himself said that the Russians were thinking about using chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine. Again, trying to get out ahead of that, because the Russians were thinking, well, maybe we'll use it and blame the Ukrainians. So this is a powerful tool, and it's I think overall it's a nifty sort of bow in the quiver of statecraft. And the Biden administration has said, well, look, we can use this with other issues. I'll just give you two quick examples. On one, it was trying to brush back the Chinese from providing lethal aid to the Russians early on, and the U.S. intelligence community, I suppose, assessed that that Xi Jinping was quote considering providing lethal aid. And then CIA Director Bill Burns did a TV interview, and he said, "Hey, this is what we see. This is what we see the Chinese doing," as a way to kind of brush them back, before they crossed the line they couldn't uncross. Well, did it work? I mean, that's always the hard part, right? Certainly it didn't prevent Putin from invading. But then again, no amount of declassified intelligence was going to prevent Putin from invading. But so far, at least according to the U.S. intelligence community statements publicly, they've seen the Chinese walking right up to that line, right, with dual-use technologies and such, but they haven't actually crossed it. The other example I was just going to mention was in Israel. As I'm sure you remember, there was an errant Palestinian terrorist group rocket that hit a hospital in Gaza, and then sort of shockingly, I think, it went viral, even through respected media outlets, that this was an Israeli bomb, or have they no shame? And the Israelis were like, look, we didn't do it. And then actually it was the OSINTers on Twitter and on the internet who were like, this it's not a bomb. This is not what this looks like. And so then the U.S. intelligence community came out and basically gave their imprimatur through the National Security Council spokeswoman, saying, yeah, this was not them, as a way to give an ally a little bit of breathing space, at least early on, in the war in Gaza. There are downsides to this as well, and as someone who was, I was, in government at 9/11. I was in government in 2000, for the terrorist attack on the USS Cole. I was working for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I was at CIA for the failure of a proper assessment of Iraq WMD, and so my concern about strategic disclosures or strategic declassification is that intelligence can be wrong for any number of good reasons, right? It's not a crystal ball as much as we wish it were. And and so yeah, it was very effective. I mean, obviously, as I said, it didn't stop Putin, but I think there was some real statecraft benefits achieved by the Biden administration. But my concern is that policymakers like to go back to things that work, especially when they're grasping for support for policies, because it's just a hard world out there, right? And it's hard to change things. And so I'm just a little concerned that intelligence is best understood as supporting policy in private. And what you see kind of goes back to the old days of the George W. Bush administration, where they're leading with intelligence publicly. Hey, we don't, it's not up to us to invade Iraq, right? The intel people say we have to invade Iraq, so we're just doing what the intel people are saying. And putting the intelligence community out front like that, and hinging your policies behind the intelligence community, puts them in a tough spot, because they can be wrong for, as I said. And so, intelligence is an estimative game. And when policymakers get out front, and they want to, delete caveats or tell half the story, which I can give you some examples of that if you want. But it really puts the intelligence community, I think, in a bit of a pickle, because the abuse that we got, I was there, after failing to prevent 9/11, obviously an enormous intelligence failure. In my view, some people say it wasn't for other reasons. Iraq, clearly, Bin Laden making a mockery of us for 10 years before we finally caught up with him. And so having when intelligence is wrong, all the people that don't really understand how hard it is, pundits, commentary, academics in the media, they say, these intelligence people are bumbling and they can't do anything right. And it took many years to recover from some of the intelligence failures that I've now mentioned. And the community is going to be wrong again, right? It's just the nature of intelligence, and I'm worried about that. And I think Putin actually missed a huge opportunity to really stick it to the U.S. intelligence community. If he would have, in February of 2022, if he would have gone right up to the line, and then by that time the U.S. intelligence community and the British intelligence community were screaming, "This is going to happen! This is going to happen! This is going to happen!" And they laid all of their credibility on the line. And of course, it did happen. So they were completely vindicated. And that was impressive, right? Down to the timing, right? In coming days. What if Putin, just as a counterfactual, said, "Oh, okay," and he backed off, and he just sent everybody back home to their bases, right? Just imagine the headlines from commentators, pundits, academics: another intelligence failure by the Americans, another intelligence failure for the Brits. These people can't call anything right. And the damage that Putin would have done between the intelligence community, and our allies, right? The French and the Germans were not at all convinced about these warnings, right? And they would have been vindicated in their doubts. All the people who are predisposed to think that the intelligence community doesn't know what it's doing, right, would now have evidence that they got it wrong. And then after Putin enjoyed that for a year or so, then he could have just, invaded the next year, right? And all of those headlines would have still stuck, right? All of that, all of those claims would be out there forever on the internet. So there are downsides. And so I just think we need to be a little bit careful about those downsides, because I think it's just going to be tempting for policymakers, even with the best of intentions. It's just going to be tempting for policymakers to go back to that well, because they do assess it as successful.
There's a lot of things that I want to follow up on that you've mentioned, but I think one that, if you could maybe elaborate on the 9/11 being an intelligence failure. You've said that others might not consider it an intelligence failure, but you do. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, sure. So, what is the role of intelligence? This gets back to first principles, and its indications and warning. And so the argument goes, made by people who I deeply respect, Paul Pillar, former senior official in the Counterterrorist Center, amongst others, deeply knowledgeable experts, uh, and others. I mean, they did warn, right, about that Al Qaeda did want to strike the United States. It wanted to strike the homeland. It was interested, in airplanes. They were taking flight lessons, and so, in a sense, the policymaker was warned, repeatedly warned that Al Qaeda wanted to do these things. And so the idea basically is that, the intelligence community doesn't set policy for what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, right? So, there are in all of these sort of places where, coulda, shoulda, woulda, right? The U.S. intelligence community isn't in charge of airline safety regulations. The U.S. intelligence community doesn't get to decide what it collects, right? Congress gives it its legal authorities, and they couldn't collect a call or prioritize a call, I think, from a safe house in San Diego back to Yemen that might have, given some, because one end of that call was in the United States, which presents problems for the NSA, and so there were, why are some of these the hijackers in the country in the first place, right? The U.S. intelligence community doesn't control visa policy and all that stuff, and so basically the argument for why it's not an intelligence failure is that the policymakers were repeatedly warned of Al Qaeda's plans and intentions. That said, I don't hold that view because at the end of the day, the intelligence community needs to be, as they say themselves, right? Go to the CIA's website, right? The CIA is America's first line of defense. And so there were failures of coordination, for instance, between FBI and CIA. And, ultimately, 3,000 Americans were killed. And, I think, it's up to the national security bureaucracy to do the best they can to prevent those kinds of things. And in fact, going back to strategic disclosure, the Bush administration actually disclosed a President's Daily Brief, a PDB, which is the most sensitive document that the U.S. government produces. It's basically, hey, Mr. President, and a certain number of advisors, a very small number. Here's what you need to know, and this is the best stuff that we have. And so on August the 6th, 2001, again, CIA did warn the president with a PDB that said bin Laden is determined to strike in the United States. And you can look at that in two ways. In one way, it sort of looks like a smoking gun, right? A month before, here's a PDB that says this is what they want to do. On the other hand, the Bush administration let it be declassified, or declassified it, I guess. They're the ultimate authority. In 98% unredacted form. Well, why, right? You normally don't see PDBs out there in the wild. They did that because the smoking gun isn't really a smoking gun, right? Who are the terrorists? Which plot? Which airlines? Which airport? With what weapons, right? What are the nationalities of the hijackers? What tail numbers of the airplanes are being targeted? What routes, right? And so it doesn't actually, on one hand, there's warning, there's clear warning. But on the other hand, it doesn't really give anyone, the ability to foil an attack. There's also a sort of a famous memo, an electronic communication, an EC, which is an internal FBI memo from Phoenix in July that basically says, hey, we see people who are quite radical, taking flight lessons. This seems to be a weird thing. And so what Phoenix does is they recommend to FBI headquarters to get the U.S. intelligence community on the same page and say, hey, should we undertake a program to go to flight schools and figure out, who's interested in this stuff? And that didn't happen. And so, I think that's a failure to coordinate effectively as well. And so, hindsight is always 2020, right? And so, it's easy to go back and see the data bits that mattered, right, and then recreate it. It's hard, of course, in the moment. But that's the sort of debate about whether or not 9/11 was an intelligence failure, versus a whole of government failure or a policy failure.
I think going back to the present, I think, or to put it that way, if we look at the time that we're talking about, then the 9/11 and Iraq and WMDs, as you said, the U.S. intelligence community was, at least in the media and in the public eye, was seen as quite discredited, as and maybe not fully trustworthy. And as you've said, especially since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, they seem to be largely vindicated. And this public image, I feel like, has changed quite radically. Whether it's the fact that they knew about the prepared invasion, or with the warning about the recent attacks in Moscow that the U.S. gave to the Russians and Russians failed to act on. Um, it does seem like there is a major difference, and that the U.S. in this war, and I assume most of the CIA, seems to be miles ahead of the Russians and the Russian intelligence community. And I wonder if you think that's true, and if there is a reason for this, or it's maybe they just have a good PR in this particular conflict.
Sure. It's an excellent point. Um, I think on the topic of the U.S. intelligence community getting its mojo back, yeah, I think it did, and I think they have every right to be proud of what they've done in terms of understanding, the Russian plans and intentions for Ukraine. So I think that's a good news story. Uh, the US intelligence community actually made the same mistake that the Russian intelligence community made, which is that they both agreed that the Ukrainians would be overrun in a matter of a week or so, right? They both thought that the Ukrainians could not put up the kind of resistance or would not put up the kind of resistance that we've seen them so heroically do. The Russians, I think, it's been reported that the soldiers had packed dress uniforms, for a parade in Moscow, or sorry, a parade in Kiev or something. So clearly they got that wrong. And I want to come back to the idea of intelligence in an autocracy, because that matters quite a bit. But for our purposes, the U.S. intelligence community also shared the assessment, and they had a hard time, I think, understanding the Ukrainian will to fight, the Ukrainian will to resist. And look, I get it, right? We spent 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, right, trying to invest heavily in armies that as soon as the first shots were fired, these we had lavishly trained and equipped these armies. They dropped everything and ran, and then you saw ISIS, driving around in U.S. Humvees and stuff. So that's not a good day. And I think you could sort of get cynical about, well, why do we train these people? Why do we give them stuff when they're just going to fold? And so with the Ukrainians, what did they have, right? The assessment had real world, the assessment about their ability to resist had real world implications, because they weren't given, as they weren't given heavy weaponry, right? Where are the fighter jets? Where are the tanks, right? Where's heavy artillery? They weren't given that sort of thing. They were given, the tools of the insurgent, right? Shoulder fired, missiles, javelins, right, to take out tanks, right? Not the heavy stuff that they needed. And I think to his great credit, the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Scott Berrier, owned that in a congressional hearing, and he said, hey, we got that wrong, and we're gonna try to figure out, how we can do a better job assessing people's motivation, assessing will to fight. And that that's just a hard thing, right? What secrets do you need to steal in order to figure out if an army is going to cut and run, right? They just do. So it's a really hard intelligence question, to sort of assess motivation. On on Putin as an intelligence officer, and of course at the Crocus City Hall massacre, the U.S. does have a duty to warn if they know, something that about an impending terrorist attack. They do have to warn, and that includes the Russians as well. Right? There's no carve out for, well, we don't like them, so it doesn't matter what happens to them. And so, I was as surprised as everybody else, I think, when I saw the story about the U.S. embassy in Moscow, releasing a statement to citizens, which is a no double standard rule, which basically is like, well, if the U.S., for instance, were to know that a certain flight had a bomb on it or a hijacker on it or whatever, right? So they would keep U.S. officials off of the plane, but let everybody else, perish on a plane, right? There's no double standard. You're not allowed to use intelligence like that, and so they have to, they had to warn. Now, at some level, the Russians. Putin's pretty delusional, I think, but the Russian intelligence services, I think, at some level, knew that the Americans, weren't just lying to them, for some sort of provocation. And um, this gets to intelligence in an autocracy, because someone like Putin, as an autocrat, uh, you know, are you going to go tell Putin, hey, Mr. Putin, I think the Americans are right, and we should probably call off, large gatherings until we figure this out, right? Then if you're Putin, you think to yourself, I'm not going to let the Americans dictate what can and can't happen in Russia, especially if they're not giving, exquisite SIGINT cuts or HUMINT or some kind of evidence or proof. And so, would you want to tell Putin, that we should listen to American intelligence? In an autocracy, that's not the kind of thing you can do. He'll shoot the messenger. And yeah, and we saw, I think, in the the weird video, the TV conference in the run up to the Ukraine invasion, right, where I think it was SVR chief, foreign intelligence chief Narishkin, say, "Oh boy," and he sort of, pushed back just a tiny little bit on Putin, and Putin snapped at him. So you, in an autocracy, you can't, you know, intelligence offered in good faith, right? It's a cliche, this whole truth to power, putting in quotes here. It can be a bit of a cliche, but in an autocracy, that just doesn't happen. And so, for a place like, in a place like Russia, even if they know that, and I think it's now clear that, that they believed ISIS's claim, for the attack. And so now the Russians have to spin it like, well, okay, it was them, but really it was Ukraine, supporting ISIS or some nonsense. Um, and this is hard for the Russian intelligence community because they have to keep up the talking points, which are nonsense. And I think they probably know they're nonsense. But at the same time, they do have to, put their eye back on the ball with the Islamic State, who has attacked Russia before. They attacked the Russian embassy in Kabul. So this is a real thing that the Russians have to deal with. In terms of being miles ahead, um, the Americans knew something was happening. Did they know that it was Crocus City Hall or whatever? Probably not. So what specifically did they tell the Russians? We don't know. We know what they said publicly, to the American people, still living in Russia, but we don't know. We don't know more than that. Um, and look, I'm the last person to defend Russian intelligence, but sometimes, as we learned on 9/11, the Boston Marathon, other places, you can't stop every attack, no matter how good you are. And this gets back to the famous line, that the IRA told Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher after a sort of a near miss assassination attempt, where they said, you need to be lucky all the time. We only need to be lucky once. And so, I have no sympathy for the Russian intelligence services, but no matter how good you are, nothing is gonna, nothing is 100%. So now I think, they have another problem on their hands, because they have Ukraine to deal with, right? And their hands are quite full, in Ukraine. But now they also have to get a handle on this threat, because it makes Putin look weak. I think, at some level he's embarrassed because he publicly, poo-pooed what was going to happen. And now he's got to rely on his, domestic propaganda organs to say, well, this was the Ukrainians, and this is why we have to win in Ukraine. And he's going to have to do an awful lot of spinning is not the right word, right? He's going to have to do an awful lot of lying to cover his tracks on this one. And if it happens again, I think, if there's one thing that Putin offers or has offered in the past, what was his sort of unique selling point, right, to the Russian people? It was stability and security. And so if he can't even provide that, the Russians, I think, will have every reason to say, well, then, why do we put up with this guy? So this is a particularly bad moment for Russian intelligence and for Putin. I think of, how he handled it.
And if you look at, and I know that it's, of course, really hard thing to do, but if you look at, the performance of Russian, as they call them, secret services in general, and their own intelligence blunders, I think that we had a tendency after the Russian invasion to look at the Russian military and say, we thought that they were really effective, combat effective force, and we're kind of seeing the opposite. It's another question to what extent that was maybe an over exaggeration as well. But if you look at the Russian intelligence services, how do you sort of evaluate their performance, and do you see them as competent or incompetent? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests. And here's what you can see in the bonus part.
They keep surprising the Russians. They keep achieving things that the Russians didn't think that they could achieve. Chinese intelligence wants to steal everything that's not nailed down. They would love to recruit people in the U.S. intelligence community, and they have done, actually. 2 famous cases over LinkedIn. It's a real threat, as Burns said, and maybe even the biggest threat. It's just that it's a different kind of threat that we're not as used to.